All right, let's wrap up our discussion of the culture of the Great Depression, cultural effects. Moviegoing would seem vulnerable in hard times, and indeed, it did drop off early in the 1930s. But by the mid-1930s, people were going to the movies in droves, record numbers. All had sound now, and by the end of the decade, many were in color. People went in part because they were an appealing way to escape the crisis. Now, movies in the 30s were tightly controlled and censored to ensure they contained nothing sensational or controversial. This was facilitated by this studio system, which a handful of production companies exercised iron control over actors, writers, and directors. You didn't hop from company to company. But neither the censor nor the studio system could or wished to avoid social questions altogether. King Vidor, great Hollywood director, his movie Our Daily Bread, 1932, and John Ford's The Grapes of Wrath, and you know what that's about, obviously, in 1940 explored political themes, edgy economic issues resulting from the Great Depression. The great director Frank Capra's films had a muted social message. By the way, to get around the censor, some directors created clever ways to convey things sort of as a subtext. But his films had a muted social message that celebrated the virtues of small towns and the decency of common people over the corrupt values of the city and the urban rich. Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, 1936. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, with Jimmy Stewart in 1939. Many of you may have seen It's a Wonderful Life. They played at Christmas a lot. That is a quintessential Frank Capra film. Most films, however, were purely escapist and were screwball comedies and are centered around a theme of sudden wealth, like The Gold Diggers of 1933. You can see why that would be an appealing theme. The 1930s, or the Marx Brothers, also had a huge reign in the zany comedies in the 1930s. The 30s marked the beginning of Walt Disney's long reign as the king of animation. Snow White appeared in 1937, following a decade of short features, so it was the first full-length animated feature, and obviously the first of many, as you well know. Two novels were made into wildly popular movies in 1939, The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. It's hard to believe they both appeared in that same year. Of course, both were contenders for Best Picture. Gone with the Wind won. Hollywood did little to challenge popular conventions on gender and race, however. Women in films were usually wives and mothers, and blacks were ignorant laborers. So the social and political strains of the Great Depression really found their voice in print rather than on the airwaves or in movies. Much literature and journalism of the 1930s dealt with the huge disillusionment and increasing radicalism of the time. Not all literature was challenging and controversial, of course. Most popular books and magazines were as escapist and romantic as the radio shows and movies, like Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. The enormously popular photojournal Life, debuted in 1936, became the most successful American periodical ever. It did some stories on politics and economic conditions, more than its competitors, but it was best known for its stunning photographs of sporting and theater events, natural landscapes, and massive public works projects. Its first cover was a New Deal hydroelectric project. It's the first one here on the left. One of its most popular features was Life Goes to a Party, which covered the rich and famous in a chatty gossip column. Other Great Depression writing, however, was frankly and openly challenging the dominant values of American popular culture. John Dos Passos wrote something called the USA Trilogy from 1930 to 1936, which attacked the materialistic madness of American culture. Nathaniel West published Miss Lonely Hearts in 1933 about an advice columnist overwhelmed by the sadness of those who consulted him with their depression-related issues. Jack Conroy's The Disinherited, 1933, also was a harsh portrait of the lives of coal miners. James T. Farrell's book Studs Lonergan from 1932 was a portrait of a lost, hardened working-class youth. So these things were considerably more edgy and critical. In the late 1930s, much of the political literature adopted a more optimistic, although often no less radical, approach to society. This was in part the result of the rise of the Popular Front. The Popular Front was a broad coalition of anti-fascist groups, mostly on the left and sort of center of the political spectrum. And of the most important in America was the American Communist Party. The party had long been a harsh critic of American capitalism and the government, which the party claimed was controlled by it. But in 1935, Moscow instructed the party to soften its attitude to FDR, whom Stalin already saw as a potential ally against Hitler. So that the Communist Party formed loose alliances with other progressive groups who began to praise the New Deal and John Lewis, the Union leader, who was a strong advocate of labor but definitely anti-communist. It adopted the slogan, quote, "Communism is 20th century Americanism," unquote. The Popular Front did much to enhance the reputation of the American Communist Party. Its membership reached perhaps 100,000 in the mid-1930s, the highest it would ever be. And of course, many of those people would regret that in the late 40s and 50s. But the Front also helped mobilize writers, artists, intellectuals, many unconnected with the Communist Party, behind a pattern of social criticism. For some of these intellectuals, the Popular Front offered an escape from the lonely stance of detachment and alienation that many had embraced in the 1920s. It's referred to as the lost generation. F. Scott Fitzgerald and his milieu would be sort of an example of that. The importance of the Spanish Civil War to the mid-1930s was a good example of how the left helped give meaning and purpose to individual lives. The war in Spain pitted the fascist of Franco against the legitimate Republican government. It attracted more than 3,000 American volunteers, known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, who fought against the fascists. About a third of them died. Hemingway wrote "For Whom the Bell Tolls" about his experience as a war correspondent, spoke of, quote, "a part of something which you could believe in wholly and completely, and in which you felt an absolute brotherhood with others who were engaged in it," unquote. The Communist Party was instrumental in creating the Lincoln Brigade and directed many of its activities. The party also were effective union organizers in the 1930s. They took a firm stance on racial justice. They were about the only group to do so. They were active in the defense of the Scottsboro Boys. They helped organize a union of black sharecroppers in Alabama, which resisted, sometimes violently, the efforts of whites to displace them from farms. The American Communist Party, however, was not the open, patriotic organization that it tried to appear as. It was always under close and rigid control from the USSR. An example of this was Stalin's direction after he signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939 to resume the old harsh criticism, thinking he was safe now and didn't need FDR. The party complied with this, and thousands became disillusioned and left. Of course, the forces of anti-radicalism were as strong as ever in America. The party's organizing efforts were strongly resisted, often by powerful congressmen. Even so, there have been few such times in U.S. history when being a part of the left seemed so respectable and even conventional among workers, intellectuals, and others. Thus, the 1930s witnessed an impressive, if temporary, widening of the ideological range of mainstream art and politics, much of it sponsored, by the way, by the WPA. The filmmaker Per Lawrence, with New Deal funding, made a series of powerful documentaries. One was called The Plow That Broke the Rains, another was called The River, that celebrated the New Deal with a harsh critique of industrial exploitation of both people and the environment. The novelist James Agee and photographer Walker Evans collaborated on something called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. It came out in 1941. It was a long, highly emotional text published originally in Life magazine, and it documented the lives of Alabama sharecroppers, memorializing their strength and even nobility. But of course, the most successful chronicler of social conditions in the 1930s was John Steinbeck with The Grapes of Wrath, a tribute to the dignity and endurance of common working people, with a not-so-subtle nod to communism.